Welcome to the video number 3 of the finMED Capacity Building Tool. I remind you that this online training is intended to complement and support the delivery of the Capacity Building Tool manual, developed by the finMED project, that you can download from the project website. In the first video, we have introduced you the roadmap for financial instrument use and implementation with its 4 phases: preliminary, design, setup, implementation. Then we explored the concept of financial instruments and briefly examined the 4 types of financial products. Then, in video number 2, we started the navigation of the roadmap for financial instruments use and implementation, exploring the preliminary phase. As we know, the preliminary phase regards background and framework conditions. Before any decision to be taken about the implementation of financial instruments, an in-depth analysis of the background and framework conditions is indeed a prerequisite. This enables to fine-tune the intervention and aligns it to the policy objectives to which it responds and derives from. During this video number 3, we start to examine the design phase. Strategic policy. Design phase most important aspects are framework conditions, importance of context, investment priorities, ex-ante assessment for the introduction of financial instruments. This video number 3 is about understanding how to properly tackle the policy framework in the design phase and to address the domestic context. In the following video, number 4, the second part of the design phase will be illustrated by considering how to set investment priorities and realize the ex-ante assessment for the introduction of financial instruments. The first important aspect of the design phase are the framework conditions. Framework conditions relevant to the implementation of financial instruments include geography, existing financial ecosystem and ecosystem context, institutional capacity, regulatory framework, and a range of more operational issues. The context within which financial instruments are implemented will affect how and how well they work. Circumstances vary between different member states and different regions, so there is no one-size-fits-all approach. These circumstances include differences in local economic conditions, in banking and legal systems, previous experience with implementing financial instruments, etc. In short, financial instruments design must be alert to context and take it into consideration. As part of this, it is fundamental that the financial instrument implementation builds on an accurate assessment of the market situation, which provides clear evidence of the need for public intervention. Because market conditions are so diverse, research on market gaps and economic structures is a key to accurate instruments design and allocation of funds. The assessment of the framework conditions requires a careful understanding of the locality in order to take account of the specific characteristics of a region and the impact of this context on market failures and potential. An analysis of the SME financing market to improve the reliability of the overall assessment. The involvement of public and private stakeholders to facilitate the market analysis and help to ensure a balanced perspective of the market situation. The development of an investment strategy based on an in-depth analysis that takes account of strategic objectives, funding sources, including proportion of private co-funding, options for fund structure and management, financial and legal aspects. A forward-looking element to take account of changing economic conditions and the funding needs of firms. A regular review to check economic circumstances and market needs. Many of these conditions are now mandatory elements of the ex-ante assessment process required before European structural and investment funds are committed to financial instruments and forerun the reasoning of the type of financial instruments to be used. The creation of a successful financial instrument is an iterative process involving trial and error, so implementation that builds on previous experience, existing structures, can gain an important advantage. The second important aspect of the design phase is the importance of context. From the review of theory combined with the assessment of empirical evidence, it is much apparent that context matters. When considering the conditions which will influence the structure, conduct, and performance of financial instruments, policymakers need to bear in mind the following three main issues: institutional and regulatory context, targeting, normal SMEs versus high-growth firms, and timing. The first important point is the crucial importance of the domestic institutional and regulatory context within different European economies. The manner in which the banks operate is obviously a crucial distinction in this regard. The overall structure of banks, together with the levels of banking competition, state ownership of banks, and bank regulation, are vastly different across various European member states. Research shows that the levels of banking concentration also vary markedly across the EU, which will obviously shape the ability of SMEs to access finance in certain countries more than others. Consequently, problems of accessing finance for SMEs are highly variable across both the euro area and the European Union more widely. Clearly, these factors need to be taken into consideration when designing predominantly regionally based schemes to be funded through the structural funds. The second important point concerns the issue of targeting. In the main, governments adopt a relatively wide-ranging approach when designing financial instruments in terms of sectoral coverage, stage of company development, company growth orientation, and export orientation. Observers have noted that in many of these regionally funded projects, financial instruments have very different eligibility criteria. Startups versus SMEs, R&D-based firms, and sectoral orientation. While there may be very solid theoretical and pragmatic reasons for this kind of targeting, this may not always be the case. This is a crucially important issue, however, as the funding requirements of SMEs are not homogeneous. Policymakers, therefore, have to pay considerable attention to the precise issues within the intended target market for different financial instruments. There is also likely to be a trade-off between the economies of scale achievable and the specificity of different programs within various types of financial instrument schemes. In other words, narrowly focused schemes targeting specific types of SMEs, either high-tech or in different sectors, may incur higher setup and operational costs, which reduces their overall cost effectiveness. Another consideration related to targeting is the impact this has on the private sector. The evidence on various types of financial instruments is the fact that they can effectively push out the private sector in some instances, a problem particularly affecting less developed regions. The use of hybrid schemes whereby the public sector co-invests with the private sector seems to be one relatively successful approach to help keep in the private sector. However, co-investment with the private sector may not be feasible with some economical disadvantageous economies where the private sector investment community is absent or nascent. In economically less developed regions, it might make better sense to help SMEs seek conventional forms of debt finance through financial instruments such as guarantee credit scheme programs. This form of finance is generally more suited to the majority of SMEs. A final important point concerns the issue of timing. A key instance in this regard concerns the nature of market conditions. In other words, timing matters. In periods of extreme economic recessions, such as in a global financial crisis, the problems facing SMEs when attempting to obtain credit are considerably worsened. These kinds of temporal factors have clear implications for the direction of public policy. During these times, efforts were made to quickly increase the supply of liquidity to SMEs' population. In many countries, directly increasing the supply of funding through loan instruments such as publicly assisted loan schemes may be a very appropriate course of action. However, during normal circumstances, bank liquidity increases and lending conditions to SMEs can improve. In other words, the nature of market imperfections is cyclical, meaning that a temporal approach towards policy making is required. And this is all for this third video of the finMED capacity building tool. I invite you to continue the training with the video number 4. For more information about finMED project and its capacity building tool, please visit the project website, in which you can find much more information, documents, news, and also links to the InterregMed program.